Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
I've always wanted to do that. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second largest theater district in the country. And welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to creating conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. I'm Cleveland Mayor Justin Bibb, and I'm honored to introduce the U.S. Secretary of Transportation and my friend Pete Buttigieg. When Secretary Buttigieg first joined us in Cleveland at the City Club, it was 2019. He was then known as Mayor Pete of South Bend, Indiana. And as our mayoral club saying goes, once a mayor, always a mayor. He was on a book tour talking about his pathway to becoming mayor of South Bend, and he was gearing up to run for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. And in that campaign, he showed the nation that mayors can lead this country. In 2021, he was sworn in as the nation's 19th Secretary of Transportation. During his tenure as Secretary, he has worked to achieve organizational excellence in the department's operations, and his focus as Secretary has been to deliver the world's leading transportation system to the American people and its economy. Now, it's worth noting today that the Secretary isn't here to talk about the recent election results. And I know that is top of mind for many folks here in the room this evening. Instead, the Secretary is going to focus on his priorities at the Department of Transportation, like supporting the historic passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Because it was President Biden who's going to give us a transportation infrastructure decade for the next generation. And as I told the folks in the meet and greet a couple of minutes ago, the Secretary was here in Cleveland a couple months ago. We're at the rooftop of the Hilton Hotel looking at our lakefront. And he said, Mayor Bibb, you guys have the most underdeveloped coast in America. And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, let's do something about it. A few weeks later, we got $60 million for the North Coast Connector to better connect downtown to our lakefront. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your vision, and thank you for believing in the importance and the power of cities like Cleveland, Ohio. So in a moment, the Secretary will come to the stage and offer some brief remarks, and he will join a candid fireside chat with our own city's Director of City Planning, Joyce Pan Wong. And if we can, let's give Joyce a big round of applause because she's leaving the city to join the Cleveland Foundation as their Chief Impact Officer. We're so proud of your leadership, Joyce. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for such a warm welcome. And a big thank you to Mayor Bibb, my fellow mayor, somebody I've gotten to know very well through our work. Thank you to the City Club of Cleveland, both for hosting me when I was an obscure Indiana mayor, and for having us here tonight. I'm so pleased to be here. I feel very at home here, partly because of this wonderful, warm welcome, partly because I'm a creature of the Great Lakes. I grew up in northern Indiana. My first real job was in Chicago. I married a Michigander who went to school in Wisconsin. We make our home in Traverse City, Michigan, which is about 4 hours north of where I grew up. And where I grew up is about 4 hours west of where we are today. Another reason I'm pleased to be here is this is a city, you know this, but this is a city that screams infrastructure. It's just a transportation city. You named your baseball team after a feature on one of your bridges. And by the way, if you stand next to the Guardians on that bridge, as I once did, and you look out, you literally see a picture of America's supply chains, the trains and trucks and boats coming into the inner waterfront, one for which the mayor and the community have such a compelling vision, which we are proud to be supporting with the $60 million for that effort. And there is so much more good work ahead. With your position on the Great Lakes and the Turnpike, and for so many other reasons, you don't need to be reminded or persuaded about how important transportation is. So, with just 6 weeks remaining in our administration, I appreciated the idea of a chance to join you tonight and share some thoughts on the work that we've done and on what it's going to mean in the coming years. The bottom line is that we have taken action to leave every form of American transportation better than when we found it. Not because we love transportation for its own sake, but in the name of people who are better off for this effort, whether it is railroad workers who did not have sick leave when we got here and now do, or whether it's airline passengers who lacked protections when we got here a few years ago and now do, or most importantly of all, people who are home with their families tonight because they did not become statistics as we began to reverse the rise of roadway deaths in this country. With a long way to go, I must say. And of course, workers whose entire life trajectories are being transformed because of the jobs we're creating with these 66,000 projects and counting that we are funding. And the best part of all of this is that these are just the early stages of the benefits that are going to continue to mount over the course of this decade. And of course, I will argue that these actions and their benefits deserve continued bipartisan support, no matter who is in charge in Washington. I started my day in Michigan. We had a visit to UAW's Local 600 in Dearborn. I toured that historic union hall, spoke with workers, heard about the jobs that are underway and the work that is coming to their members. And then I was in Monroe County to see where federal dollars are helping to replace the River Raisin Bridge between Detroit and Toledo. This bridge is part of two distinguished lists. It's one of the most economically significant bridges in the country, meaning it's a vital connection to jobs and schools and for supply chains. And while it's on our list of the 18 most economically significant bridges we're supporting, it's also on our list of the 11,400 bridges that we are now funding repairs, replacements, or improvements to around the country. 60,000 plus vehicles drive on that bridge every day. Millions of trucks cross it a year. Traffic is a huge problem. It's in poor condition and would soon go critical if it weren't for this funding. It's just one example of the places we're working at across the country, including back where I grew up in St. Joe County, Indiana, where a multi-billion-dollar GM EV battery plant is under construction. I sat down with electricians and apprentices there last week who told me about the work that they're going to be doing. They told me that 38 projects that they're working on, just in that one local alone, are happening in some way because of the Biden-Harris administration's policies. These last 3-4 years have brought levels of factory construction and infrastructure investment that would have seemed laughably optimistic if I had stood in front of this audience 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, and I did stand in front of this audience, and if I were to go around promising them. It wasn't that long ago, growing up in South Bend, that I repeatedly absorbed the message that jobs in manufacturing, the building trades, were long gone and were not going to come back. The idea that the only way to get ahead was to get out. I know a lot of people in and around Cuyahoga County grew up hearing that same message. When I became mayor in 2012, unemployment was in double digits. Per capita personal income in our community was barely over $18,000 per person. We got the city growing again, but we still waited for help from Washington as empty promises of infrastructure funding came and went. We put an end to the emptiness of those promises in 2021 when President Biden signed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Of course, our first order of business was confronting the pandemic, something that even now I think is dangerously easy to forget how quickly it all changed. Because when we got here, that pandemic was still in the midst of causing the most profound and widespread set of societal and transportation disruptions since 9/11. And we were confronting decades of underinvestment in our infrastructure, and decades of what amounted to a failed consensus that held sway in boardrooms and in Washington alike, that had laid waste to domestic manufacturing, especially in the industrial Midwest. While the pandemic exposed the fragility of our supply chains, it unleashed the global inflation that we've only recently brought back to normal levels. Much of what we faced really was decades in the making, as well as the result of the crises of the moment. President Biden came in with a clear-eyed recognition that we needed to act quickly and boldly, and I'm proud to have played a part in what came next. It's now been 3 years since President Biden signed that infrastructure package, the biggest in 70 years. And soon it was followed by the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. And the result is all of those projects moving forward in every state in the union. Just in the Midwest, as I mentioned, we're rebuilding the River Raisin Bridge. All of the cars and trucks that pass across that bridge and so many like it will finally have a means of passage that reflects life in the 21st century. We awarded $130 million to RTA to replace their fleet of rail cars for the Rapid. Those rail cars were made in 1982. So was I, by the way, so it's about time to do something about that, I guess. And as I mentioned, in partnership with Mayor Bibb, nearly $60 million award to transform the Cleveland Memorial Shoreway from a limited access highway to a pedestrian-friendly boulevard that will expand access to the lakefront and the near west side. And $27 million going toward the modernization of the Port of Cleveland, which also just received nearly $95 million from the EPA, made possible by the Inflation Reduction Act, to make the port more sustainable and reliable and more efficient. If I were to visit a couple of these projects every day for the rest of my life, I would not live long enough perhaps to see half of them. That's how much we're doing. And many of them are going to take years to complete, but even before we're all benefiting from the finished product, the very process of building them is changing lives. Those building trades members who'd been told to give up just a few years ago are now bursting at the seams, getting work opportunities and getting the kind of respect that will propel and motivate an entire generation of workers to proudly build America and make a good living as they do it. Since we got here, more than 1.6 million manufacturing and construction jobs were created. So many of those are good-paying union jobs. So the three pillars of the president's agenda to invest in America, the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act are such a collectively big deal that I believe, in the tradition of the New Deal, the Square Deal, and the Fair Deal of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, this ought to be known as the big deal, because it's a big deal. Our infrastructure policy and our industrial strategy has yielded a decisive answer to the question that everybody's wringing their hands over back when I became mayor, which is whether we could in fact have a future of making things in this country. Now, so many of the factories that are being built around the country today will be open in 2025, 2026, 2027. There are hundreds currently under construction in Sheffield, Ohio, in Lansing, in Glendale, Kentucky, and more. That's not just because of the funding, it's also a matter of policy. In this administration, for example, we are committed to actually upholding the Buy American laws that say if you're spending taxpayer dollars, they ought to be used to buy products made here in America. Like those new rail cars for RTA, manufactured domestically, or the steel being used in all this infrastructure made at places like the Cleveland Cliffs facility I saw in Toledo, or another one I saw in Steelton, Pennsylvania. And those jobs mean we're not just building roads and bridges and highways and airports and ports, we're building livelihoods. It means presence under the tree. It means a new car or truck in a driveway, the chance to own a home. They mean, in short, that the middle class is growing instead of shrinking. And just as importantly, for those of us who come from communities in the industrial Midwest, they mean that you don't have to leave your hometown in order to build your future. That is what becomes possible when we recognize the scale of our challenges and bring an even greater scale of ambition to confronting them. And importantly, breaking the old false choices that were served up to us in the past and that held us back. One false choice was that you could either support sustainability and the environment, or you could support the economy and jobs, but not both. We'll tell that to the 500 union electrical workers in South Bend who will be working on that GM EV battery factory project before it's even finished, or the hundreds of auto workers who will be working inside when it's finished. Another false choice is that you could either do right by workers and support unions, or you could have profitable companies and economic growth, but not both. Tell that to the workers in this country getting historic raises while their employers continue to post remarkable profits. Just in the transportation sector where I work, rail workers are getting raises and sick leave, port workers are getting increased pay, warehouse workers, truck drivers, aviation workers, and auto workers, through the power of collective bargaining, are earning historic wage increases and benefits and protections that they ought to have had long ago. And the industries are doing just fine. Better than fine. Another false choice we were fed was that we could either have the industries of our traditional past or we could look to the future. But just like wage rises and company success have been traveling together, so have job growth in traditional industries with industries that didn't even exist when the railroads and the ports and the original factories around here were being built. That battery plant I keep talking about in northern Indiana is right near an Amazon Web Services data center that just broke ground, creating hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of jobs for the building trades. Here in Ohio, of course, there's the Intel semiconductor facility nearing completion in Columbus. At the same time as an EV battery manufacturing plant is coming to Jeffersonville. And then there were the people who warned, in another false choice, that any effort to close or confront America's racial wealth gaps or gender gaps would come at the expense of every other group of workers, as if that was zero sum. Yet, we have delivered the lowest black unemployment rate on record, the lowest Latino unemployment rate on record, and the highest working age women labor force participation rate on record, not by taking anything from anyone, but by encouraging common sense fairness and common sense steps like making childcare available at a work site so that more women can enter construction jobs, make great money when they do, and bring their talent to this national project of rebuilding American infrastructure. My point is that lots of people are better off and no one is worse off because that's happening. Some warned us that government action to protect consumers would cause irreparable harm to business, or even somehow to consumers themselves. But we're wrapping up one of the most pro-consumer administrations in generations, and corporations are doing just fine. For example, we created new protections to ensure airline passengers were guaranteed automatic cash refunds when their flight was seriously delayed or canceled, and they didn't want to be rebooked, so you didn't have to fight your airline in order to get your money back. We reinvigorated our oversight of the airline industry, held airlines accountable, and the results are, the last 2 years, we've seen some of the lowest cancellation rates in a decade and a record number of American passengers flying. There is so much opportunity to continue good policy and good investments in American infrastructure and in our future. We're going to need leadership at the local level, as well as the state level, as well as the federal level, that is focused on supporting and empowering, not dividing and distracting, Americans. The industrial Midwest has been reminded, sometimes in the cruelest of terms, that a national rising tide doesn't automatically lift all boats. Not the way that they told us it would in the days of early automation and the trade deals that were going on when I was a kid. But today, the industrial Midwest is also showing the country and the world how the right kind of intentional and ambitious growth can lift up a region once told it was dying and power the whole country's growth as we do. I'm not saying everything is always a win-win. We do have to make choices sometimes. And in those cases, this administration has been unapologetic about our choices. A choice to do it right versus do it overnight. To make it in America versus to make it as cheaply as possible. To prioritize workers and consumers over short-term profitability. But in making those choices, we have shown that more often than not, with the right policy, everyone comes out better than before. Now, the work is far from done. Every administration leaves with unfinished business. And anyone in a job like mine knows that somebody else will cut the ribbons on some of what you started building. But this isn't the work of one secretary or one president or one administration. It is the work of a generation. So much will depend on what we, the generations now in positions of responsibility, choose to do in this moment. Because we collectively will choose whether the progress of these last few years will be developed or whether it will be destroyed. If we get it right, we will have a good answer to give our children, who will undoubtedly ask us exactly what we all were doing back in the 2020s when so much seemed so uncertain. So my goal is this. When I was a kid, growing up among collapsing factories from decades past in my neighborhood and on my way to school, I had to really listen to those stories from the old-timers and use my imagination, imagine hard, to picture what it was like when the downtown was bustling with pedestrians and our factories were heaving with workers and our neighborhoods were flush with prosperity. It really took imagination to picture that prosperity of the past. And then it took a lot of imagination for our generation to picture the prosperity we could build for the future. So the goal is that by the time my kids, who are now 3 years old, my son and daughter, are old enough to think about things like history and industry and wealth and poverty, I want them to have the opposite challenge. I want them to have to struggle, really reach into their imagination to imagine what it would have been like when factory workers were being laid off by the thousand, when someone would hesitate to sign up for an apprenticeship program for fear of finding work when they completed it. When people questioned whether our nation could ever be a manufacturing powerhouse, when you would come to a once thriving downtown and find just about nothing going on there after 5 p.m. I wanted to take enormous powers of visualization to picture how our factories and our downtowns and our training programs could possibly have once been empty. And even though, at least based on how potty training is going, it's going to be happening sooner than I think that I'm getting those questions, I'm encouraged because I think we're more than halfway there. If I think about where we started, if I think about what it was like when I was growing up and where we have come today, I think we are more than halfway there, which is good because we may not have a lot of time. Thank you so much for the chance to address you tonight. I will take my seat, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. It is a huge honor to host you here in Cleveland. Unbelievable that you sold out in less than 3 minutes, so you're very popular here. And part of that is, you represent a new generation of leaders. You represent a new voice in government, and you're also the son of the Midwest and of the Great Lakes. So I'd love for you to explore and explain more why invest in a place like Cleveland, South Bend, other Great Lakes areas when we've experienced decades of decline. And we've seen population decline over decades. We'd love to hear more about why invest here, what's your vision for the Great Lakes in the future, and then what we can do collectively to make that happen.
Well, as I said, I grew up imbibing that message that success meant getting out. So when I was 18, I did. I went to the East Coast for college, and only when I got there did I find out that I was very much from somewhere. a lot of us had that experience where you realize just how Midwestern you are when you find yourself not in the Midwest anymore. And in fact, I was just reflecting on just how Midwestern I was at. We had just enough time to stop at one of those rest stops on the turnpike, and I went in to get a cup of coffee, and I didn't say hot or iced, and I got iced, and I couldn't bring myself to this happens. This is just our culture, right? And I think our culture is actually one of the things we have going for us, because we understand that there is a relationship between the past, the present, and the future. Sometimes the complexities of our past and the ups and downs of our past, they hit us over the head. We won't be fooled into thinking that anything is permanent without making it so, because we've seen what it's like when everything that was once imagined to be permanent breaks down. But we also know what's possible when you take advantage of things like the natural resources that are here. The Great Lakes are the largest and most significant freshwater system in the world by far, in a century in which water is going to matter more than it ever has. The transportation and logistics networks that we have, which are relevant, first of all, for the same reasons they were always relevant, but also for whole new reasons. Like, I don't know if everybody is aware of this, but a lot of the most important fiber optic connections in the country are right under where we are. Because when they were running the first fiber from Chicagoland to the East Coast, it made sense to follow the old highway and railway conduits like 8090. And there's huge opportunity in terms of the connectivity here. So much to work with. I would even argue that our climate, our weather around here, I know today might not seem like what some would call a Chamber of Commerce day, but being in that temperate climate is going to matter more than ever. So there's unbelievable potential here. And there's a great deal of need. One of the reasons why we've invested so much here is that we're looking for infrastructure that needs work, and there's infrastructure that was built 100 years ago here, and just as important as ever, but really has needed that investment and hasn't gotten it. So we see the need, we see the opportunity, we see the moment, and most of all, this refusal to give up that has reanimated so many cities. Cleveland, Detroit, South Bend, where I grew up, large and small. And I believe that we should continue going long on that proposition because there's so much more that could be achieved.
Amen, thank you. And as someone who has worked on the lakefront here, and many in the audience who have also worked on the lakefront, we're so grateful that we do live on the Great Lakes and we have an opportunity now to move it forward thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So let's talk a little bit about that, because dispersing over 66,000 project funds is no easy feat. And as a public administrator, I can only imagine what that was like, right? It's large grants, but also small grants, right? Save Streets for All, those are in the six figures, and then you have these large amounts that you disperse. So this $1.2 trillion package is unprecedented, but what I also think is unprecedented is your approach to that and the values that you included in the package. So values such as equity, values such as sustainability, or local leadership. Talk a little bit about why those values are important to transportation and how you as a leader led that paradigm shift in a federal agency.
Well, I think that far too many decisions have been made in the past that were transportation decisions that implicated a lot of other things like safety and equity and climate. But those things weren't considered, and the result was profound. So that's especially true right now when we talk about sustainability, because right now, the transportation sector is the single biggest sector of our economy emitting greenhouse gas pollution. To me, that's just a challenge for us to be, if we're the biggest part of the contributions to those emissions, then we ought to aspire for our sector to be the biggest source of solutions, especially now that we've cracked the code on how to have many of those solutions create good-paying union jobs in places like the industrial Midwest. It turns out every decision you make about transportation is a decision about the future of our climate, whether you admit it or not. Now that we know, there's no excuse for not taking that into account. Same thing with equity.
where many communities had transportation projects done to them rather than with them, often because they lacked the wealth or political power to resist or reshape them. The whole point of transportation is to connect. And yet there are so many places where transportation function to divide, sometimes contributing to racial and economic divisions within a community. And by the way, that's not just something that happened in the South or in one city. We've seen examples of that everywhere. But we pay attention to that not to make everybody feel guilty about our transportation systems, but because we can do something about it. And we are. So many places around America getting funding to change the effect that a previous decision had on a community. In Chinatown in Philadelphia, the Vine Street Expressway, just cut Chinatown in two. We're decking over it, and as we do it, we're going to create something that's the rarest of things in the middle of a big city, which is net new land. That's what you get from the deck. In Detroit, I-375, it will be a matter of raising 375 to a boulevard, because it turns out that's enough to carry the cars adequately, better than adequately, and you can restore the vibrancy that you have when it was possible to cross the street instead of face this canyon when you come up to it. And so what we recognize is there are chances right now with this funding, not only chances, a responsibility with this funding to get it right this time. And the biggest examples of all have to do with safety. If you have ever, and so many of us in this part of the country, walking on a bridge that was designed 90 years ago or on a roadway that just was designed without pedestrians and taken into account, understand that the importance of a good sidewalk or enough of a passage for cars and bikes to go by, that's not ornamental, that's fundamental because safety is at stake. So those are the kinds of things that we take into account, and I don't believe any of them should be considered ideological. I know sometimes they are, but I don't think they ought to be. And that brings me to the last thing you mentioned in your question, which is local leadership. Out of our 66,000 projects, the number of projects that was designed in the headquarters of the US DOT and at Navy Yard is 0. These are local visions. The idea was never that the answers were going to come from Washington. It's that more of the funding should. And that's what we're finally doing. Working with leaders like Mayor Bibb, like the RTA, states, tribes, transit agencies, airports, anybody who has a vision that we can help fund. We want to make it happen.
I love that. The expertise is local, right?
Absolutely.
The expertise is local. Let's transition a little bit to talk about the future of mobility. So that's a topic that many people are interested in, whether it's EVs. Here locally, we have NASA Glenn, which is doing sustainable aircrafts, autonomous vehicles. These are all very popular ideas right now, high-speed rail. But I want to touch on the bread and butter of transportation and the future of public transit. So the pandemic really crushed public transit, right? Ridership dropped, people felt hesitant to take it, and we're still trying to get back to that normal. So how do we sustain and rescue public transit in a time like this?
Well, it's critically important because of all those reasons we talked about: safety, sustainability, equity. And it's just the mark of a well-designed and thriving community to have good transit. And good transit means something that's not only a means of last resort for people who have no alternative, but a means of choice for people to get to where they're going. Someone from another country once posed the question of whether a truly flourishing civilized society is one where even the poorest person can afford a car, or whether it's one where even the richest person might decide to take the subway or the bus. You don't see a lot of millionaires on public transit outside of New York, although I think that's a revealing example, because what you see there is it just makes sense for more people. So even if you can't afford a car, you're going to be at least as likely to take transit. It's quicker. And that's one of the reasons why we're proud that President Biden's infrastructure package contained the most funding for transit that we've ever done at the federal level. Now, there's more to be done. And it is financial but also cultural to establish kind of a habit of taking advantage of transit. When you get it right, there's a virtuous cycle because more people find that it's for them, choose it at least some of the time. That creates the means to have more frequency and greater reliability. The other thing is technology can help because Many communities, especially in the Midwest, especially small to mid-sized communities, would benefit from transit, but they're not dense enough to have a hub and spoke system or service every 8 minutes. So tapping into some of these GPS technologies that can fuse ride on demand with a more traditional system, I think could open new possibilities for transit. The bottom line is, your horizons broaden when you have an affordable, easy means to get to where you're going. And with all of these jobs being created, we've got to make sure more people can actually get to those jobs. It's exactly what we're doing with these dollars.
Thank you. Well, we have time for one more question here before we move on to the audience Q&A. And this is an attempt to blend sort of the leadership question as well as a personal question. So you are the youngest cabinet member in the Biden administration, 42 years old. You, I believe, were the youngest mayor of South Bend, is that right?
Second youngest.
Second youngest, okay.
There's this guy
And
like
you were the
100
youngest
years ago.
person to serve as the Secretary of Department of Transportation.
I assume. I haven't looked
Okay.
it up, but
Okay,
I
think
would assume, yeah.
So we'll just say that you are.
All right.
But
I'll
I mean,
I'll
during
take it.
this time, I mean, you had major life changes. You welcomed twins,
Yeah.
you and your partner Cheston. You have 3-year-olds who relate to the potty training comment. You also dealt with some of the most critical emergencies we've seen in transportation. Train derailments, the airline passenger issues, supply chain delays, and yet you still have to return home to be papa to your kids, right? And so, you know, my question is, share with us how you maintain your humanity in it all, and other leadership lessons from your time in public service, because it does grind and wear on you. So we want to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, nothing has helped me maintain my humanity more than having kids. You know, this job, as you can imagine, it's very heady. I may not be a millionaire, but you experience all of these, it's just head spinning sometimes, the intensity and the privilege that comes with being a cabinet official. But then you have all these little status shifts that come your way because you spend a lot of your time with 3-year-olds. I mean, literally, something that has happened in my life has been I've been at the house, and I get off the phone, and the phone conversation ends with something along the lines of, "Let us know any more data you need, sir, before you go to the White House tomorrow." Immediately followed by, "Dad, Papa," in my case, "come wipe my butt." And you know what? That's what I'm going to do. Because that can't wait. The memo can wait. The White House will still be exactly where it is the next day. I can stay up later and look at the data, but some things need immediate attention. And of course, it's important to be just seeing the world through the eyes of these humans. On Election Day, I started out my day at home, and our kids are early risers. I don't know where they got that from. They get up early. It's dark out. It's pouring out some cereal. And then Chasten was going to cover down for me as I went across the street to do a quick TV appearance. And our daughter, usually I keep it pretty generic. I say, "I got to go work. I'll be back in a minute." But I was a little more specific for some reason. I said, I got to go do a TV hit, and then I'll be back. And our daughter says, "But Papa, wait." I was like, "What?" She goes, "How do you get out of TV?" I was like, that's a reasonable question, I guess. I wasn't sure how to explain it other than say, "I promise you I'll be right back here soon." But look, for every working parent, even with the extraordinary good fortune and benefits that come with having a role like mine, it is almost impossible for everybody. You will always have that feeling like you're not doing enough at home and you're not doing enough at work. And the best you can do, of course, is to try to keep those priorities right side up. To ask yourself which thing, if you have to miss something that matters at work or at home, ask yourself which thing you would more regret missing 5 or 10 years from now. Have someone in your life who will hold you accountable. And this is where my husband is, well, this is one of many reasons why my husband is fantastic, but he will make sure that I will not miss bath time or dinner for anything that isn't worth it. And recognize that nobody's got it figured out. At least nobody I've met. If anyone here has, I'd like to talk to you afterwards. But also as a policy matter, we got to make it easier. That's why I'm so excited about things like putting childcare at work sites and just some common sense measures to make it a little bit easier. Because it has to be possible in a healthy economy to support people being good parents and effective workers at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Joyce. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. For our live stream and radio audience, I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club. I want to thank all of you so much for joining us here and online. Direct questions from the audience have been a hallmark of City Club forums since our inception in 1912, and we're delighted that the Secretary has agreed to join in this respected tradition. As our board president mentioned earlier, before the program began, with the large capacity here at the Mimi Ohio Theater, we invited all of you to submit questions in advance with the goal that we would ensure equitable access to the Q&A and also including questions from a diverse cross-section of audience members and issue areas. So questions were selected by City Club staff with those factors in mind, and those individuals who are going to ask the questions are here with us, and we're so grateful for that as well. And I want to just note that the Secretary has not seen these questions in advance. So with that, our first question, please.
Hello, Secretary Buttigieg. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Larissa Malcolm, and I'm a social worker from here in Northeast Ohio. And here's my question. As you prepare your transition out of your role, what advice would you give Cleveland's leaders on effectively collaborating with the next administration to continue advancing critical transportation projects, particularly those aimed at economic development and equitable access for underserved communities?
Great question. Thank you. And thank you for your service as a social worker. So I served as mayor across an administration from each party, and you feel the difference, of course, in policy priorities. But I will also say our system, for better and for worse, but largely for better, really puts a lot of these decisions closer to home. This is one of the things, even on our watch, I've been urging community members to think about. Most of the decisions about most of the money, even the money we're sending out, the money that'll have our Biden-Harris name on it on some level, actually flows through a state or a metropolitan planning organization. Often one whose committee meetings you can just show up at and speak, unlike Congress where you actually have to be invited to speak. You can just show up and say what's on your mind. So local residents are empowered and local leaders are empowered to continue carrying things forward. Obviously, the level of support for what you're trying to get done changes depending who's in charge in Washington. But if you know what your community is about, and if you know who needs your help and support, don't wait on Washington. Washington isn't going to have the answers, even though Washington should be providing more of the funding, and on our watch it has been. So I would urge anybody who is contending with some issues like how transportation decisions affect equitable access to prosperity to continue that work. And remember also that even if these things don't always command bipartisan support in Congress, they tend to earn bipartisan support closer to home. That's part of how we got the bill done, even in Congress. The obituary of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law must have been written a dozen times before President Biden actually signed it that day on the south lawn of the White House 3 years ago. And what that tells me is, if you go to the people that elected officials are actually accountable to, even the ones in Washington, with why these things need to continue, why they matter, why they need to be set up so everybody and not just a privileged few can benefit from them. It's a powerful message. And that's going to be especially important for all the work that we have funded but that has not yet been built to keep that momentum going. So my simple message is keep it up and don't give up.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Secretary. My name is Emily Baca, and I'm a City of Cleveland resident, and I'm proud to work for the Ohio Environmental Council, a statewide environmental advocacy organization. From your time as mayor to your time at the federal level, you have seen the real and devastating impacts of climate change on communities. But you've not just seen about it, you've talked about it, and you've taken real action. And so You've taken action to reduce climate warming emissions and build healthier, more climate resilient communities. Can you tell those of us who are gathered here who care about this, how do we keep up the momentum for climate action when we face political pushback?
Did you say local pushback?
Any political pushback.
Any political pushback. So I think often, I say this in many contexts, but I think often our salvation comes from the local. One thing that was going on during the Trump years when I was mayor was a coalition of what was then called the C40 and has grown far beyond 40 cities to more than 100 what are called climate mayors. It was a group of cities that got together and they figured out, between us, we have a significant chunk of the world's GDP. Why are we each waiting on our country's capital to catch up when we could just come together and do it? And they started taking up sharing best practices and ideas and giving each other moral support and where appropriate political support to get big things done. And that created momentum that we could then supercharge with federal funding and support when President Biden came into office. And so, look, there are times when you've got wonderful harmony between what's happening nationally and locally. And there are times when you don't. But I see this bottom-up energy and enthusiasm that I imagine, Emily, you're part of. I can see that you're part of, to make sure that the people closer to home understand what climate means to them. The other thing I think is really important is we got to stop talking about this like it's about polar bears. Nothing against polar bears. This is about us. This is about our lives and livelihoods. I don't love the kind of language and terminology of saving the planet. This kind of it's right for the planet, because to me, like the planet doesn't need us to save it. It's been here for 5 billion years. The question is whether the planet will be hospitable to life. And having had that experience, as you acknowledged in your question, when I was mayor and we had a flood that was so severe and so sudden that they said this is a 1,000-year flood. And 18 months later, I'm activating our Emergency Operations Center for our second annual 1,000-year flood, saying, what the hell is going on, right? This is happening, and you don't have to be living in California or Greenland to be feeling it. It's happening in the Midwest, too, in communities like South Bend. Asheville, North Carolina, where I saw the most shocking devastation.
My name is Chanel Smith-Wiggum, and I lead community engagement at Key Bank from Alaska to Maine. And so my question is a banking question. And in particular, how can communities and federal government leverage the Community Reinvestment Act to support and invest in infrastructure in low to moderate income communities?
Well, we've got to make sure that we get private capital off of the sidelines. And some of the most exciting and least well-known programs in our department have been credit-related programs. And that's a big part of everything from the financing stack for the high-speed rail that's connecting Las Vegas to Southern California that we already broke ground on. And we'll have passengers in seats by the end of this decade if they hit their marks. All the way through to projects to build up transit-oriented development. Take some of the floor plates of these commercial buildings and turn them into residential in places where there's too much office space and not enough housing. So we're doing what we can federally to help adjust the economics, but of course so much it depends on what institutions like yours and in the banking sector, especially when you have institutions that are a little closer to home. That are regionally based or locally based, that don't see these properties as numbers on a page, but understand what they mean, whether we're talking about a neighborhood with some vacant lots that could be assembled and have houses on them again, or whether we're talking about the small and medium-sized enterprise that is doing most of the job creation in most of our regions. That is vitally important, and there has to be there has to be patient capital, which often that patience comes at the local or regional level. And there has to be a commitment to align with community leadership, and I can feel the civic energy you have here. Community leadership to help make sure that wherever you're taking things isn't just the project or pet project of one CEO or one political leader, but really a community aligned around a direction. And when that happens, incredible things follow. I've seen it, and I'm convinced that there is much more where that came from, and fewer places could be more primed to demonstrate what happens when you unlock all of that than an area like Cuyahoga County. You like how I learned how to say Cuyahoga with one syllable, by the way? I've been
Nice.
I've noticed the more local you are, the fewer syllables you say. You say that. So I've been practicing. I hope I got it right. Thanks so much for your question, Charlize.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Kent Smith. I'm an Ohio State Senator. My staff and I are very intrigued by your rules of the road from your 2020 presidential campaign. We think it's a modern approach to collaborative leadership, but how would you describe it? And can you share an unexpected positive or negative benefits from your rules of the road philosophy? Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking about that. And thanks for your service in the state Senate. So during the time I was running for president, I felt it was very important, especially because I had gone from, it's difficult to describe the proportions of the change from leading a city. I was, at the time, it felt like a large-scale operation, about $300 million operation and about 1,000 employees. But my personal office as mayor was 6 people. And when you're seeking the presidency, you were building a coalition of dozens and then eventually hundreds of staff and organizers, thousands of volunteers, ultimately hundreds of thousands of donors, and hoping to earn the support of millions of voters. And especially somebody who's a little newer on the scene, I thought that it was really important to convey what we were about in ways that went beyond talking points or policies. And that's where the idea of specifying our values came from. And they were values like, their specific set, things like respect for the process, for the presidency, for our competitors in what at the time was a 20-way race for the nomination. Respect, belonging, because I thought belonging was the most important things you could build in a campaign, but also was one of the most important things we were trying to build for the country. Teamwork, truth, boldness, responsibility, substance, discipline, excellence, and joy. I wanted joy to have the last word because I continue to believe, even now, that the political process doesn't have to be styled after a wrestling death match. There can be joy in that process. And I wasn't sure how far it would go, but I believed in it. I had seen actually one of my predecessors, Joe Kernan, who was the mayor of South Bend, and then became governor, and who I learned a lot from, had done something similar for his city staff when he was mayor. And I hoped people would pick it up, but you never know, when especially the pace we were at and the things that we were shooting off into the world, from policy proposals to white papers to interviews. But next thing I know, I'm going to events and people are wearing T-shirts with the 10 values, the rules of the road on them. And that was when I knew we were really getting somewhere. Because people are more likely to, you got one of the T-shirts right there? Oh, wait. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Yeah, see? Oh, that's great. In the end, you don't actually know whether your exact policy prescription is going to land. You don't know how much sense it will make. Again, look at what confronted this administration when we got there, right? I had all these great ideas of what I thought would be needed, and then by the time President Biden asked me to come do transportation, our transportation systems had basically shut down. And the biggest problem with our airline sector was to stop it from collapsing. And then a year later, it wasn't collapsing, it was booming, and the biggest problem was to get airlines to treat passengers better. So rather than assuming that your policy answer you came up with in 2019 is still going to be the right answer in 2023, make sure people know what you're about, so that when some unsolvable problem comes your way, they know the values you're going to hold on to in order to navigate it. And I found that process then and since has served me well, and I look forward to seeing what values you express to your team and your constituents that you will look to as your North Star in your work. Thanks for reminding me of that. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary.
I think I'm being played off, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary. Thank you. Our deep, deep gratitude to you, Secretary Buttigieg, Director Huang. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And thanks to all of you who submitted questions as well. You're the heart and soul of the City Club. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like all of you. You can learn out more about that and also all of our upcoming forums at cityclub.org. I want to mention again, too, that our forum today has been the Leonard Ronis Transportation and Planning Forum. Mr. Ronis was a transit leader at the local, state, and national levels, one of the architects of regional transit authorities across the state of Ohio. And he was, as you know, the first GM of the Greater Cleveland RTA and founder and president of the Ohio Public Transit Association. We're so grateful to the Ronis family for your engagement. I would also like to thank you, yes, please. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, Cleveland State University's Levin College of Public Affairs and Education and the Washkowitz College of Engineering at Cleveland State University, and also our friends at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District for your sponsorship of the Sustainable Northeast Ohio Series at the City Club. And finally, thanks to our partners here at Playhouse Square and IdeaStream and my colleagues at the City Club of Cleveland. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. Have a wonderful evening and a happy, happy holiday. Thank you. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.